Iran finally played its strongest card. The Strait of Hormuz was no longer just a waterway. It had become a global pressure point, a narrow corridor where geography and geopolitics collide with extraordinary force. For decades, military strategists, energy economists, and world leaders had warned about this moment. And now, without any further warning, that moment had arrived. One of the world's most important oil arteries lay quiet under the night sky. Massive commercial ships carefully moved through the narrow passage, their enormous hulls riding low in the water under the weight of millions of barrels of crude oil, carrying energy supplies toward distant continents, toward factories in Asia, heating systems in Europe, and fuel depots across the Americas. For a moment, everything seemed calm. The sea was still. The stars reflected off the dark water. And then, the silence ended. Far on the horizon, two bright flashes suddenly appeared. Within seconds, the silence of the sea shattered. An explosion tore through the night, and flames began spreading rapidly across the steel hull of a tanker. The fire moved faster than anyone aboard could have anticipated. Crew members rushed onto the deck in panic as alarms echoed through the ship, their voices swallowed by the sound of burning metal and hissing steam. Their only escape was the lifeboats being lowered into the dark water below, small orange vessels dropping into a black sea, lit only by the growing fire above them. Soon rescue vessels arrived, cutting through the waves at full speed, pulling survivors from the cold sea one by one. Some crew members were injured, others were in shock, a few would not be found at all. Yet even as the rescue operation was still underway, new reports began flooding in from different parts of the strait. The attack was not limited to a single ship. Some vessels escaped with only minor damage, a hull breach here, a disabled engine room there, but the message was unmistakable. The Strait of Hormuz was no longer safe, and the world was about to feel the consequences. Panic quickly spread through global energy markets. Oil prices began rising sharply as traders in London, New York, and Singapore realized what this meant. Futures contracts spiked within minutes of the first reports. Investors moved rapidly, trying to calculate the potential duration of the disruption. This was not just an isolated attack, it was a calculated display of strategic pressure, a signal delivered not through diplomatic channels, but through fire and smoke on the open sea. The Strait of Hormuz may be narrow, only about 33 kilometers wide at its tightest point, but it carries an enormous portion of the world's oil supply. Roughly 1/5 of all globally traded petroleum passes through this single corridor. There is no easy alternative. The pipelines that bypass the strait have limited capacity. The other sea routes add weeks to shipping times and billions of dollars to costs. This is precisely what makes the Hormuz so powerful and so dangerous. Whoever controls it or threatens it holds leverage over the entire global economy. Even small boats armed with missiles can threaten enormous tankers passing through these waters. Fast attack craft began moving in coordinated formations, racing across the dark waves in patterns that had clearly been rehearsed many times before. Some carried anti-ship rockets, others launched drones into the low sky above the strait. A small unmanned aircraft, costing far less than the weapon systems designed to counter it, could now guide a missile directly into a massive oil tanker carrying hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cargo. The asymmetry of that equation was deeply unsettling to military planners across the world. As the attacks increased, the crisis grew rapidly and with alarming speed. Commercial shipping companies began making urgent decisions. Vessels changed their routes, rerouting around the strait whenever possible, choosing longer paths through the Arabian Sea and around the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. But these new routes added days to delivery times and dramatically increased fuel costs. Insurance premiums for vessels entering the region surged overnight.
Some underwriters refused to offer coverage at any price. The economic disruption was spreading far beyond the waterway itself.
Energy markets around the world watched every development with growing concern. Trading floors that are normally driven by quarterly supply data and seasonal demand forecasts were now operating in real time, reacting to military reports and satellite imagery rather than traditional economic indicators. Each new report of violence pushed oil prices even higher. The pressure on the global economy began to build in ways that hadn't been seen since the most acute moments of previous Middle Eastern crises. Governments started discussing the possibility of tapping strategic oil reserves, emergency stockpiles that had been built up precisely for moments like this one. At the same time, military tensions were rising with equal speed. Fighter jets began flying constant patrols above the Persian Gulf, their radar systems sweeping the sea and sky in overlapping arcs. On the water, destroyers and frigates moved into escort positions, their crews at battle stations around the clock. Commercial ships were now traveling under heavy military protection, enormous tankers surrounded by warships in scenes that looked more like the convoy operations of a past century than 21st century commerce. Yet everyone was asking the same question. Could this crisis escalate into something far larger? A miscalculation, a single missile fired at the wrong target, a commander making a split-second decision under pressure. Any of these could transform a confrontation into a full-scale conflict. And the world waited, anxiously, for the answer. As attacks continued, warships from several nations began appearing in the region in growing numbers. One by one, navies deployed forces to protect international shipping lanes that their economies depended upon. American carrier strike groups repositioned in the wider Gulf. European frigates moved to escort duty. Regional navies placed their own vessels on high alert. Soon, the Strait of Hormuz had become one of the most heavily militarized waterways on the planet, a narrow channel containing more combined naval firepower than most major conflicts of the previous decade. Radar systems scanned the horizon without pause, day and night. Every unidentified movement, every small vessel, every low-flying aircraft, every unexplained radar return was treated as a potential threat and tracked accordingly. Maritime traffic slowed dramatically as security protocols tightened. Vessels were required to identify themselves repeatedly, submit to inspections, and wait in queues that stretched for miles outside the entrance to the strait. Insurance companies raised their war risk rates dramatically as the probability of conflict increased. Tankers began rerouting around the region, seeking safer but significantly longer paths. These detours increased shipping costs, disrupted global supply chains, and sent ripple effects through energy-dependent industries worldwide. Meanwhile, fighter jets continued patrolling the skies above the strait. Surveillance aircraft monitored the sea from high altitude, streaming data to command centers located hundreds of miles away. Destroyers escorted convoys of oil tankers through the narrow passage in carefully choreographed movements. Yet tensions continued to escalate rather than subside. In the darkness beyond the shipping lanes, fast attack boats gathered in the shadows of the coastline. Engines roared as they accelerated across the water in coordinated swarms, moving in patterns designed to overwhelm point defense systems through sheer numbers and unpredictability. Targeting systems locked onto large commercial ships moving slowly through the strait, enormous vessels that could not maneuver quickly and could not outrun anything. Suddenly, a missile launched from one of the small boats, streaking low across the sea surface toward its target, its exhaust trail glowing briefly before it disappeared into the dark. On a nearby destroyer, alarms immediately began sounding across every deck. Missile defense systems activated within seconds. Operators made rapid decisions. An interceptor rocket launched into the sky with a concussive roar. Moments later, a bright explosion lit up the darkness as the incoming missile was destroyed mid-air.
the debris scattering across the water in a shower of burning fragments. But the confrontation was no longer avoidable. What had begun as a series of calculated pressure operations had now crossed into open combat. Naval guns fired across the waves. One of the fast attack boats was struck directly and erupted in a ball of flames before sinking rapidly into the sea. But there were more boats and more missiles. Soon the entire strait became a battlefield. Missiles, rockets, and cannon fire crossed the night sky above the water in both directions. The conflict escalated rapidly, pulling in more assets from both sides with each passing minute. Far beyond the battle zone, a massive aircraft carrier group moved into position with deliberate speed. Escort destroyers surrounded the carrier as it entered the Persian Gulf, their sensors active and their weapons systems fully armed. On the flight deck, fighter jets prepared for launch in disciplined sequences, ordnance crews loading weapons, flight deck officers clearing the catapults, and pilots climbing into their cockpits as engines roared to life around them. One after another, the aircraft launched into the night sky and climbed rapidly toward their designated patrol altitudes. Fighter formations soon appeared above the Strait of Hormuz, their presence alone representing an extraordinary concentration of airborne firepower. Meanwhile, along the coastline, missile batteries prepared their own response. Radar towers scanned the sea from rocky cliffs that offered both concealment and clear lines of fire toward the shipping lanes below. Suddenly, an anti-ship missile launched toward the strait, a large, fast weapon designed to defeat the defenses of modern warships. On a destroyer, radar detected the incoming threat almost instantly. Fighters in the air quickly received new targeting instructions and turned toward the coastal launch site. Within minutes, guided bombs struck the position in a sequence of precise explosions. A massive blast illuminated the entire shoreline, and the missile battery fell silent. The battle had now expanded fully across land, sea, and air. Iranian naval forces began moving out from nearby ports under cover of darkness. Patrol boats and missile craft left the harbor in tight formations, pushing toward the strait in a direct challenge to the advancing international fleets. The move was bold, but U.S. destroyers were already in position, their radar systems locked on to the approaching vessels from the moment they left port. Guided missiles launched from vertical firing cells on the warships, tracking their targets across the dark water with precision. One of the approaching vessels was struck directly and erupted into flames, its hull breaking apart within seconds. Soon, multiple ships were exchanging fire across the sea in a chaotic and rapidly escalating engagement. Fighter jets dove from altitude, launching rockets at naval targets below. Explosions rippled across the dark waters in a series of flashes that lit up the surrounding sea for miles in every direction. Burning ships drifted on the current as thick columns of smoke rose high into the night sky, visible from satellites hundreds of miles above. The battle had reached its decisive turning point. One by one, the attacking vessels were destroyed or forced to retreat back toward the coastline. Eventually, the sea began to grow quiet again. Only the distant glow of burning wreckage remained on the horizon, slowly fading as the fires consumed themselves. Helicopters arrived at first light, their rotors beating steadily as they surveyed the battlefield from above. Fragments of ships and scattered debris floated across the water in slow-moving fields. Rescue teams searched for survivors among the wreckage, finding few. The battle was over, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. News of the confrontation spread rapidly across the world within hours. Financial markets reacted immediately and decisively. Oil prices fluctuated violently as uncertainty about future supply gripped trading floors globally. Stock markets fell sharply as investors calculated the potential economic impact of a prolonged disruption. Governments gathered in emergency meetings to discuss the crisis and coordinate their responses. Diplomats debated urgently how to prevent further escalation, knowing that each hour without a ceasefire increased the risk of an even larger confrontation. Naval forces continued to patrol the region in strength. Warships guarded the strait around the clock, while commercial shipping slowly and cautiously resumed under escort. Convoys of tankers once again crossed the narrow passage under heavy military protection, their movements carefully coordinated to minimize exposure. The strait remained open, but only just.
The lesson of those extraordinary hours was impossible to ignore. This narrow waterway holds enormous power over the global economy, power that is entirely disproportionate to its physical size. Even a brief disruption lasting only days can shake energy markets across the entire planet, raise prices for consumers in dozens of countries, and force governments to make decisions with consequences that reach far beyond the region itself. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely a geographic feature. It is a lever, and whoever places their hand on that lever commands the attention of the world. In the end, the sea returned to calm. Ships continued their journeys across the horizon, carrying the energy that the modern world cannot function without. Sailors who had survived the battle returned to their routines. Markets stabilized, at least for the moment. Diplomatic channels reopened. The immediate crisis passed. Yet the strategic importance of this place remained entirely unchanged, because the Strait of Hormuz is more than just a passage between two shores. It is one of the most critical choke points on Earth, a place where geography, energy, and military power intersect in ways that no amount of diplomacy has ever fully resolved. And as long as global energy flows through these waters, its future will always carry a shadow of uncertainty. The ships will keep moving, the radar systems will keep scanning, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the shipping lanes, the next crisis will already be taking shape.